Yesterday, I tweeted something out. It got a lot of flack from folks on the left. I tweeted out that President Trump did a bad job in the early days of this, because he did do a not good job in the early days of this. And I said, so did mostly everyone else. Now, that doesn't mean they did an equally bad job or talked about this in equally a bad way, but there are gradations of how seriously people took this. And what I basically said is nobody took this incredibly, incredibly seriously until early March. And people went nuts. No, we all took it super seriously all the way back in late January. We took it super seriously going all the way back. Okay, let's define super seriously, because let's talk about what exactly has been necessitated. Millions of tests right across the country, shutdowns of all public events, shutdowns of ability to gather, mask wearing, antibody tests, vaccination development, like actual measures. That would have been taking it super seriously. Do you remember any time in February, Democrats calling for exactly the measures we've taken in March? Do you remember any of that? I don't. Do you remember Democrats opposing President Trump saying that we should not allow travel from China? I remember that. So here, let's go through the timeline, because again, not everyone was equivalently head in the sand about this. Not everyone was equivalently dismissive of this. And I generally agree with the idea that in the early days, Trump was far too dismissive of this thing. I think that's true. I think there are also Democrats like Bill de Blasio, who's the epicenter of this thing, who are super dismissive. And I have a question for all the folks on the left who are really questioning, Trump was so dismissive. He was so dismissive, and we were taking it seriously. Really, I don't remember all your criticism of Bill de Blasio in the epicenter of this thing, who was spending weeks on end telling people to go out in public. But I want to trace the timeline here, because I think it's accurate to get this timeline down. We have to be honest about this. The reason is not as a defense of President Trump. The reason is because there's a narrative that is being set, and the narrative is being set right now. Okay, on the one side, there's the narrative that I have put forward, which is that government basically sucks at everything. They are late on everything. They don't do the things they are supposed to do, and it's a bipartisan failing, because when you have a giant lumbering moron, which is the government, the best you can hope for is that they respond in slow and delayed fashion and in powerful fashion, and you need that to happen sometimes. But to expect that the government is ever going to be a government that moves with alacrity and quickness, and that the government is always going to foresee every crisis, and that government is ever good at this stuff, that is wrong. And the reason that's important is because people are trying to extend pandemic politics to non-pandemic politics. They're trying to say, well, if only the right people had been running this thing, it all would have been fine, which demonstrates that if the right people ran government, everything would be fine. Government could control everything. Now, quick note, when I say that this is a bipartisan failing, that everyone failed here, and again, there are a few exceptions, like Senator Tom Cotton was on this thing early, Chris Murphy was on this thing early from Connecticut. But with very few exceptions, everyone botched this thing. I'm not even talking just about the United States. Boris Johnson just locked this thing down like a week ago in the UK. Italy was late on this thing, which is why their hospitals were completely overrun. Spain was late on this thing, which is why their hospitals were completely overrun. France was late on this thing, which is why their deaths per million population is higher than those in the United States. Okay, so this is not just a bipartisan failing. This is a failing of government. Government is not perfect. Government is staffed by incompetent people, and even competent people who are there have to work through bureaucracies. Government is not all-knowing. Government is not all-powerful. Government is a blunt force instrument, and sometimes you need blunt force instruments, like in a global pandemic. Understood. But the case that Democrats have been trying to make is that it's all Trump, and if Democrats had been in charge, this would have been perfect, which demonstrates that in a time of non-pandemic politics, if we just put Democrats in charge, all ills will be solved. This has never been true. It will never be true. So they're launching investigations instead, trying to undermine Trump's 2020 reelect campaign. That's what's going on. And they're trying to set the narrative early that if only Joe Biden or Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton had been in charge, all of this would have been avoided. The Democrats are now launching investigations from the House Select Committee on the coronavirus response in the middle of the pandemic. Like, there's plenty of time to do this in, wait 6 weeks. But they're going to do it right now because it is top priority that we blame Trump as fast as possible, which is what this is going to come down to. Even though we all know what this really is, right? There will be a 9/11 Commission style report. And what it will find is that years in advance, there were systemic failures, because this is what happened in 9/11. And then there were warnings that were not properly heeded. And then the warnings were not taken seriously enough. And in hindsight, we should have been able to see that somebody was going to fly a plane into the WTC. But Democrats are intent on politicizing this thing right now, and driving that narrative that I talked about before, which is that in the end, government could be incredible at this. Government could be. If you just put Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi in charge, if you just put Joe Biden, who's not even alive, in charge of the government, then all of this could have been prevented. You know what is one of the key things that keeps people alive in a pandemic? That would be ventilators. And you know what people have been warned about for literally decades? Lack of ventilators. And you know what government completely ignored? The ventilators. You know what it turns out people need in times of pandemic? N95 masks. You know how many times that stockpile was blown through and not resourced? A fair number of times. You know what we're going to find? We're going to find that governors, state governors, local mayors didn't do the job they were supposed to do in warning people. We're going to find out that our policy with regard to China was a complete failure. We're going to find out a lot of things. You know what we're not going to find out? That if President Trump had not been president, then all this would have magically been solved. That's what we're not going to find out. But that is exactly what Democrats are going to try and pitch